Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Tea for One. I'm your host, Rowan, and we will dive into all topics tea related. Biology, history, culture, growing, producing tea, and so much more. Episode 1 will focus on Earl Grey tea. Who was Earl Grey? How did Earl Grey tea come to be? Why were there wars over tea? Hopefully we can answer all those questions by the end of this episode. So, before we begin, I highly recommend you get a nice cup of tea and find a peaceful spot to listen as we talk about Camellia sinensis. Earl Grey, a black tea known for its bold, full-body flavor with sweet, floral, and bitter notes. When compared to other black teas, there is something that just makes Earl Grey, Earl Grey. This is thanks to bergamot, a citrus long thought to be a cross between a lemon and a bitter orange. Oil from bergamot's rind is the not-so-secret to Earl Grey's distinctive flavor. Earl Grey tea is an extremely popular blend in the West, and considering how tea is the second most consumed beverage in the entire world, only after water, it is safe to assume that a lot of people like this tea. The origins of Earl Grey tea are numerous and riddled with tall tales, but most center around Charles Grey, the second Earl Grey. Yes, Earl Grey is not an actual name, but a title given to a family of nobles in Britain, and that title still exists today with the 7th Earl Grey. Charles Grey was born in Northumberland, England in 1764, and was surprisingly progressive for his time. When he served as Britain's Prime Minister from 1830 to 1834, he passed modernizing laws, including the abolition of slavery in Britain, reformation of child labor laws, and improving voting rights for a more democratic system. Despite these notable achievements, the second Earl Grey is primarily known as the old British guy that a tea is named after. Funny thing about that, historians aren't even sure of exactly how or why the tea blend was named after Earl Grey. At the time, adding flavors like bergamot to tea was seen as distasteful and shameful, as adding strong flavors like that were often used to cover up bad-tasting teas. So why would Earl Grey be connected to something so unsavory at the time? There are many stories claiming the true origin of the legend of Earl Grey and his tea. One tale says that on a trip to China, Charles Grey came across a child drowning in a river. Charles ordered one of his men to rescue the boy, and the father was so grateful that he gifted Charles a case of tea infused with bergamot oil. This legend, although heroic and fun, is undoubtedly false, as the second Earl Grey never stepped foot in China. Another legend claims that Charles Grey requested a special tea blend that would hide the taste of their well water. In Northumberland, England, the water is very alkaline because of limescale and other minerals. Black tea and bergamot are both fairly acidic, so in theory, this would neutralize the water. However, there is no proof this is the reason they drank Earl Grey tea. But what is true is that Charles Grey and his wife, Lady Grey, served tea with bergamot at diplomatic events, which quickly became popular with the other nobles of Britain. One of the more plausible theories to the origin of the name of the renowned tea blend is actually credited to Charles Grey's work. When Charles was Prime Minister, he changed a major policy that shattered the East India Company's monopoly on China. At the company's peak, it was the largest corporation in the world and had over 260,000 hired soldiers. That was double the size of the British Army at the time. We will get into more about the EIC later though, as they are one of the reasons tea left China to begin with, even though their actions were despicable. Charles Grey's policy let China have free trade with all of Europe, and the tea trade boomed overnight. The theory says that the Earl Grey tea blend was a gift from a Chinese diplomat, who was grateful for this change. Yet, there is no record of this gift to Charles, even though it is plausible. The only theory with actual evidence to back it is perhaps the most realistic to human nature. The first records of Earl Grey tea were from advertisements from the 1850s to the 1860s. The second Earl Grey, though, died in 1845. Just 7 years after the second Earl's death, a merchant had tea for sale called Grey's tea or Grey's mixture. At this point in England, tea was starting to be consumed by everyone, not just nobles. Because the demand for tea was so high, merchants were selling as much as they could for the highest price, despite the quality of the tea. Merchants and tea sellers would put all kinds of things to improve the color and taste of tea. Some merchants would put poisonous flowers to be aesthetically attractive, while others added sheep feces as colorizer. Bergamot was one of the more reasonable additions to hide the flavor, and this merchant knew that. So he sold it as Grey's tea, to perhaps associate the late Earl with his poor quality tea in the hopes of more buyers. A few years later, in 1880, the first record of Earl Grey tea was made by a different tea company, likely influenced by the seller before him. But there is no concrete evidence of the merchant's intentions or the reasoning behind naming the tea Earl Grey. Again, all of those theories are just that, theories, and at the end of the day, it's up to your personal interpretation of all these legends on what actually happened. But there's still a couple gaps in the history of Earl Grey tea. Like, how did it get to Europe? And didn't you mention wars at the beginning? Well, let's jump back in time to talk about the most monstrous corporation of the era, the East India Company. Just to note, throughout this episode I will call the corporation by different names, like the East India Company, the East India Trade Company, or the EIC. So one of the most historically impactful companies was the EIC. It was an English company founded in 1600 and finally fell apart in 1874, and during its height it accounted for half the world's trade. They were of the first Europeans in the Indian Ocean and quickly made a foothold over eastern India. Eventually, the East India Trade Company became a ruling body over India, as gifted by England, and their monopoly began to grow. At first, the big market was for cotton, silk, indigo dye, and saltpeter, which is used for gunpowder, and exotic spices like nutmeg and cloves. There is also records of the EIC involved in slave trade starting in the mid-1600s. A considerable amount of those records were destroyed after the company was caught by the British Royal Navy for having quote-unquote illegal trade after Charles Grey abolished it in the early 1800s. The EIC had a lot of fingers and a lot of pies, but one of them they could not get a complete control over was tea. China had been cultivating tea for centuries when Europe finally got a taste for it. At this point in time, in the early 1600s, China had very strict trade practices with the rest of the world. The Chinese emperors knew that they had unique goods and the rest of the world would trade nearly anything to have. Those main goods being saltpeter, silk, and tea. At first, the East India Company and China were on good terms. They traded silver for tea, Britain got its tea, and China got its silver. The more tea Britain got, however, the more it wanted, and Britain's supply for silver was not replenishable like tea leaves. The East India Company acted on this, diplomatically asking to trade tea for other prized trade. The Chinese emperor wrote back, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. There is, therefore, no need to import manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce." The East India Trade Company took these as fighting words. At this point, the EIC had done some terrible things, but I believe this is where terrible turns to despicable, all for greed. The East India Company had a large supply of special poppy plants from the Middle East. Yes, the company also had footholds there. This poppy plant can be made into opium, which had previously been used as a medical remedy in other parts of the world. However, in the late 1600s, opium began to be smoked, which led to an intense addiction. China had a ban on opium after it began being smoked, and knowing this, the East India Company smuggled thousands of chests of opium into China, and an opium addiction became an epidemic. A Chinese diplomat wrote a letter pleading for the English ruler to stop this opium contraband, but the letter never reached them. Throughout the EIC's history, no bad news ever reached England's general public, and in fact, the EIC's tea advertisement often showed happy native women picking tea. But in actuality, tensions grew and the soldiers were massed on both sides. It was a slaughter. The British had superior guns and ships, leading to a swift defeat. The Treaty of Nanking was written in 1842, and Hong Kong, as well as a few other cities, became ports for the EIC free trade. The treaty also forced a $21 million payment to Britain. This concluded the First Opium War. The Second Opium War happened a few years later after the Chinese Imperial Commissioner fought against opium trade. Because opium trade became so profitable for the East India Company, they fought over it. The British won, and a new treaty was written that legalized opium trade and opened up the rest of China for British merchants, in expanding the transportation of Chinese workers as cheap laborers. Both of these wars and their causations were vile and highlighted the worst of humanity's greed. This history is often brushed under the rug, but I believe it's important to know all facets of history, as to not repeat the mistakes and to appreciate developments we as a society have made. Between the First and the Second Opium Wars was something a little less sinister and, if anything, a bit outlandish. The East India Trade Company had a monopoly over tea trade, but at the end of the day, China grew and produced the tea. To have total vertical integration, the EIC needed not only to steal heavily guarded tea plants, but to also learn how to nurture and craft them into tea. This would be a difficult job, and the company needed someone who was up for the task. That man was Robert Fortune. Fortune was a Scottish botanist fresh out of his apprenticeship, looking for work in London. The EIC hired him to work in China for 3 long years collecting plants. Somehow, probably through monetary gifts, Fortune, dressed as a Chinese merchant, was allowed to visit multiple tea plantations across China. His tasks were to acquire seeds and whole tea plants and to learn techniques for tea plantations being built in India. Not only did Robert Fortune go unnoticed by the Chinese government for 3 years, but about 10 years over 2 decades. He kept journals of his travels and took notes of the tea-making process. One of these first notes was so elegantly written, "I cannot give a better idea of this operation other than comparing it to a baker working and rolling his dough." During his time in China, he sent hundreds of tea plants to India, and moved skilled tea producers from China to India to work on the plantations. Of these hundreds of tea plants that were sent over to northeast India, only a handful survived. It didn't help that the tea plant varieties that Fortune chose were grown for green tea, and all of Britain wanted black tea. At the end, the local Camellia sinensis subspecies were found in Assam that were perfectly adapted for the northern regions of India and produced good black tea. Though Robert Fortune's knowledge of tea growing and producing were still valuable. In the end, through wars, spies, and all-around crappy practices, the East India Company had an iron grip on tea trade throughout the world. Eventually, the company dissolved by Act of Parliament, but the effects the company had can still be seen today. Okay, that was a lot of history, and I don't plan on covering any more this episode. We didn't even cover the origin of tea, or the differences in tea types, or how it's actually produced. We will cover these topics in future episodes, but for now, let's talk a little bit more about the iconic Earl Grey tea. As mentioned earlier, the primary components of Earl Grey tea are black tea leaves and bergamot. Black tea is made when tea leaves undergo an oxidation process, which chemically modifies the leaves and creates a stronger, more bitter flavor found in most black teas. As for the bergamot orange, it can be infused in tea 2 different ways, either coating the leaves in bergamot essential oils or by adding the dried bergamot orange rinds. With the second method, the citrus flavor infuses during the brewing process. Tea steeping, an essential part to tea preparation, yet so controversial. The longer you brew tea, the more potent the flavors are, but the more bitter the tea becomes. You can physically see the color change depending on the brew length, the lightest ones looking like off-colored water, and the darkest ones looking like black coffee. Most people have a preferred way and duration of steeping, and it can vary greatly. Avid tea drinkers will have precise temperature and duration for each kind of tea. Most tea companies will put a recommended steeping time. For Earl Grey, it is typically between 3 to 5 minutes. But at the end of the day, it is up to personal taste and experimentation to see what you like. There is a science behind tea brewing, however, in the form of kinetics. First it was history, and now there's physics in my tea. I promise I won't go as in-depth, but there's some interesting stuff to discuss. So the whole concept of tea is to extract flavors from the leaves into the water, creating an enjoyable and healthy drink. Leaves are dehydrated for storage and to extract the flavor using this science. Adding dry tea leaves to hot water, which acts as a solvent, creates different concentrations in the chemicals in the leaves and then in the water. The water should be relatively pure, while the leaves carry a few different chemical compounds, like polyphenols, amino acids, enzymes, pigments, and other minerals. The water is attracted to these chemicals in high concentration, which causes them to disperse throughout the water in a process called diffusion. If you leave your tea alone or perhaps forget about it, all the different diffusible components of the tea should be completely dispersed and achieve equilibrium. On average, however, these components only make up 2% of the actual tea. The rest is all H2O. Now that we have some background knowledge on all that is Earl Grey tea, let's make the perfect cup of tea. Since tea is 98% water, high quality water is important. Filtered water or spring water are both good options, as they limit the amount of minerals like calcium and magnesium, which can reduce the overall flavor of tea. Because Earl Grey is a black tea, it has to be brewed at a hotter temperature for longer times than most other teas. Between 200 and 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 90 and 100 degrees Celsius are optimal temperatures. If you don't have an electric kettle with temperature control, don't fret. At sea level, water simmers at about 190 and boils at 212 Fahrenheit. It drops a degree every 1,000 feet of elevation. So, if you're eyeballing it, aim for just off a rolling boil. As we mentioned before, steeping time is ultimately up to personal preference, but a major factor to weigh in is not only the temperature, but how the tea is presented. Is the Earl Grey in a standard cellulose tea bag or one made from silk or cotton? Is it a rectangular shape, circular, or pyramid? Is it loose leaf tea where you have your own container to steep it in? The rate of diffusion increases as the surface area of the tea increases. In other words, the more contact the water has with the tea leaves, the faster it will brew. The temperature affects diffusion in the same way, so keep that in mind while preparing your tea. If you're using a tea bag, it already has the appropriate amount of tea for an 8-ounce cup. If you're using loose leaf tea, then about 2 grams or a tablespoon of Earl Grey is a good amount. If you're curious about the differences in steeping time, you can pour off some of your tea brewing just to taste test. Just remember not to brew it too long because it'll get bitter and create a dry tasting sensation in your mouth. The most high quality loose leaf Earl Greys can be steeped multiple times, so don't throw away those used tea leaves. Now that you have a cup of hot Earl Grey, there are numerous additions that can be added. In the days of Charles Grey, milk and sugar were extremely popular for tea time in London. Any kind of sweetener can be used though, like honey, flavored syrups, or molasses. Any kind of milk substitute works too. In fact, there are many Earl Grey based drinks, some even alcoholic, but the most notable one is called London Fog. London Fog is an Earl Grey tea paired with honey, milk, and vanilla extract and can be served hot or iced. All that being said, I recommend you try your Earl Grey tea in its purest form to truly get an appreciation for its wonderful taste, and maybe to ponder the journey that tea has made to get in your cup. That was a lot, but hopefully you learned something interesting about the legendary Earl Grey tea, or the tea itself. Next episode, we will discuss green tea and matcha. We will dive into the origins of tea, how camellia sinensis is special for tea, and the different kinds and purposes of green teas. This is Tea for One, and until next time.